The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets of the neighborhood where Kevin lived. It was a warm evening, and the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting filled the air. Kevin, a 28-year-old father of two, had just finished a long shift at the local grocery store. He was tired but content, looking forward to spending time with his family. Little did he know that his life was about to take a drastic turn. As he walked home, Kevin noticed a commotion a few blocks away. A group of people had gathered, their voices rising in agitation. Curiosity piqued. He decided to take a detour to see what was happening. As he approached, he saw police cars flashing their lights, and officers were speaking to a woman who appeared distraught. Kevin felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen too many instances of police interactions in his community that ended poorly. Suddenly, he felt a firm grip on his shoulder. Startled, he turned to find a police officer glaring at him. "You need to come with us," the officer said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Confused and frightened, Kevin asked what was happening. The officer didn't respond, instead pulling him away from the crowd and toward a police car. "Wait, I didn't do anything," Kevin protested, but his words fell on deaf ears. The officer shoved him into the back seat, and as the door slammed shut, Kevin's heart raced. He had never been in trouble with the law before. What could possibly be happening? As they drove to the precinct, Kevin's mind raced with thoughts of his children. He had promised them he would be home for dinner. He thought of his partner Lisa, who was counting on him to help with the kids. Panic set in as he realized how quickly his life could unravel. At the station, Kevin was led into a small interrogation room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air felt thick with tension. An officer entered, flipping through a notepad. "You're being charged with robbery," he stated flatly, as if reading from a script. Kevin's heart sank. "Robbery? I didn't do anything. I was just walking home," he exclaimed, desperation creeping into his voice. The officer leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. "We have a witness who identified you. You fit the description." Kevin felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. He knew he was innocent, but the weight of the accusation felt suffocating. He tried to explain where he had been, but the officer cut him off, insisting that they had enough evidence to proceed. Hours passed, and Kevin was left alone in the room, the reality of his situation sinking in. He thought about the witness who had misidentified him, the racial biases that often clouded judgment, and the systemic issues that plagued the justice system. He felt a sense of helplessness wash over him. How could he prove his innocence when the world seemed stacked against him? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a public defender entered the room. Her name was Maria, and she looked exhausted, her hair pulled back in a messy bun and dark circles under her eyes. "I'm here to represent you," she said, her voice lacking the enthusiasm Kevin had hoped for. She quickly flipped through his file, barely making eye contact. "We need to get you ready for your arraignment." Kevin felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she would help him. But as she began to explain the process, he noticed her distracted demeanor. She was clearly overwhelmed, juggling multiple cases at once. "I'll do my best," she assured him, but Kevin could see the fatigue etched on her face. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was just another case to her, another statistic in a broken system. As they prepared for the arraignment, Kevin's mind raced with questions. Would he be able to tell his side of the story? Would anyone believe him? The weight of uncertainty hung heavy in the air, and as he was led out of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. The morning of Kevin's arraignment arrived quickly. The courthouse buzzed with activity, the hum of hurried footsteps, the murmur of voices, and the clang of courtroom doors opening and closing. Kevin sat on a hard wooden bench, fingers nervously tapping together, as he waited for his name to be called. Maria, his public defender, finally appeared beside him. Her expressions were tired, eyes red from too many sleepless nights, textbooks and case files tucked under one arm. She glanced at Kevin briefly, her voice low and rushed. "We don't have a lot of time for prep, Kevin. The court days are packed, and I have other clients waiting." Kevin wanted to ask questions, share every detail, but sensed the pressure she was under. He knew that many public defenders had overwhelming caseloads, but he never imagined it would affect his own defense. Maria barely skimmed his paperwork as a bailiff called his name. It was time. Inside the courtroom, rows of people sat silently while the judge began the session. When Kevin's case was called, Maria rose quickly, giving Kevin just a moment to collect himself. The prosecution presented their case with confident ease, relying heavily on the witness who accused Kevin. The witness's testimony was vague but charged with assumptions painted by implicit biases. Maria stood to respond, but her defense was thin. She had little time to investigate, no expert witnesses, and limited resources to challenge the prosecution's claims. She asked basic questions, none of which discredited the witness's story strongly. Kevin felt helpless as he watched the proceedings unfold, realizing the disparity between the prosecution's thorough preparation and his own hurried defense. The judge listened carefully but seemed to lean toward the prosecution's narrative. Each question Maria asked felt like a quick dart, easily parried by the opposing counsel. Kevin's story, the details of where he was during the robbery, the people who could vouch for him, barely made it past brief mentions. The courtroom atmosphere tipped toward a foregone conclusion. As the hearing ended, Maria whispered to Kevin, "We'll have more chances, but right now the system moves fast." Kevin nodded silently, but inside he feared that this was just the beginning of a long, uphill battle against an overwhelmed defense and an unforgiving system. Outside the courtroom, Kevin caught a glimpse of Maria hurrying away to her next case. He noticed the worn papers in her hand and the exhaustion etched deeply across her face. It dawned on him that his fate was tied not only to his innocence but also to a justice system stretched beyond its limits, one where many like Maria battled to provide representation but were inevitably outmatched. As Kevin walked home that evening, his mind was heavy with the uncertainty of his future. The fight for fairness seemed distant, but despite the odds, his resolve grew. He would not let his story be silenced. He owed that to his family and to himself. Weeks passed, and the day of Kevin's trial finally arrived. The courthouse felt even more intimidating this time. A huge, cold building with marble floors and towering ceilings, where every whisper seemed to echo. Kevin sat quietly beside Maria, who still appeared rushed but was trying her best to prepare him for the battle ahead. During the trial, Kevin struggled to keep hope alive. The prosecutor painted him as guilty, emphasizing the witness's testimony and playing on ingrained prejudices. The repeated mentions of the neighborhood Kevin lived in and his past minor run-ins with the law were used to suggest a pattern, even though those previous encounters had never led to charges. Maria tried to challenge the narrative, but the court seemed to move against her. With limited time and resources, she could not call the alibi witnesses who had seen Kevin hours before the crime. She couldn't afford expert testimony or thorough evidence review. Instead, she could only raise general doubts, hoping the jury would listen. Kevin felt invisible in the courtroom. Every time he opened his mouth to speak, Maria reminded him to stay silent, whispering that she would handle the questions. The weight of helplessness crushed him. The prosecutor's words felt like lightning bolts, each one deepening the jury's suspicion. The jurors, many of whom were from outside Kevin's community, glanced at him with judgmental eyes. Kevin knew he was facing more than just a trial. He was confronting a system and society that often saw him as guilty before the facts were considered. Throughout the trial, Kevin kept thinking about Maria, the overworked defender barely able to help him in the maze of legal hurdles. He wished she had more time, more power, more ability to truly fight for him. But as the days dragged on, he realized that the system was designed in a way that left people like him vulnerable. The closing arguments felt rushed. The prosecutor's voice was strong, convincing, fueled by the biases unspoken but understood. Maria's closing remarks were softer, less persuasive, battling exhaustion and frustration. After the jury was sent to deliberate, Kevin sat alone in the courtroom, the silence deafening. Minutes felt like hours. When the verdict was finally read, guilty, his heart shattered. The room blurred as he struggled to hold back tears, understanding that this conviction was not just about his case. It was about the disparities and failures of the justice system. As he was led away in handcuffs, Kevin vowed he would fight, not just for himself, but for others like him who were trapped in a broken system that treated them unfairly. The days following Kevin's conviction were a blur. The cold walls of the prison cell became his new reality, a stark contrast to the lively home he longed for. Each morning, he woke to the echoing clang of the doors and the distant voices of guards and other inmates. Though physically confined, his mind was consumed with memories and a relentless hope for justice. Kevin's family visited when they could, their faces filled with grief and helplessness. Lisa, holding their children close, fought back tears as Kevin reassured them, promising to keep fighting. Every visit was bittersweet, a reminder of the life he once had and the uncertain future ahead. Inside the prison, Kevin encountered many men who shared similar stories, caught in a system that seemed bigger than any one person. They spoke of rushed trials, inadequate defense, and the invisible burden of race shaping their sentences. Their stories echoed Kevin's own experience, reinforcing the deep-rooted problems of the justice system. Despite the bleakness, Kevin found strength in small victories. Letters from his children, support from community organizations, and the knowledge that he was not alone. He began writing to legal aid groups, sharing his story and pushing for a review of his case. Each letter was a step toward hope. But the reality was harsh. The appeal process was slow and complicated. Time weighed on Kevin's spirit, and moments of doubt crept in. He wondered if the system would ever listen, if his voice would ever be heard beyond the cold walls and courtroom. Still, Kevin refused to give up. His experience had opened his eyes to the inequalities many faced: public defenders swamped with cases, courts moving too quickly, and the deep-seated racial biases infecting judgments. He became determined not just to fight for himself, but to be a voice for those who could not. As days turned to months, Kevin prepared for the next phase. The appeal, with cautious optimism, knowing that the road ahead was long but refusing to let injustice define his life. After months of waiting, a breakthrough came when Kevin's case was accepted for appeal. His new legal team uncovered the rushed nature of his original trial and the lack of adequate defense representation. The appeal argued that Kevin's conviction was unfair, influenced heavily by systemic failures and racial bias. In the meantime, Kevin took on a new role beyond his personal fight. Through letters, phone calls, and visits with advocacy groups, he shared his experience of how overburdened public defenders like Maria could not provide effective representation. His story became a powerful example of why the system needed reform. Community leaders and activists rallied, using Kevin's case to highlight the disparities faced by Black defendants. They pushed for increased funding for public defenders, better training to reduce racial bias, and fairer trial procedures. Kevin's voice rang out clearly, not just as a man fighting for his freedom, but as a symbol of a deeply flawed system. The appeal court agreed to review Kevin's conviction carefully. Finally, the long-awaited day arrived when the conviction was overturned due to lack of sufficient evidence and unfair trial conditions. Kevin's freedom was restored, but his fight was far from over. Now outside the prison walls, Kevin dedicated himself to advocacy, working with organizations to ensure others would not endure what he had. He spoke at forums, met with lawmakers, and mentored young people facing the justice system. His story was one of resilience but also a call to action. Kevin's journey revealed the painful reality of a justice system weighed down by racism and inequality. But it also showed the power of perseverance and the potential for change when one refuses to be silenced. His hope was that one day, no one would suffer because they lacked the resources to fight back, and justice would truly be blind and fair for all.